네, 안녕하십니까.
Nice to meet you all. I am Professor Rhee from Seoul National University.
이렇게 갑자기
So I did not expect for myself to become the first speaker, and I teach my students about fluid hydrodynamics, and this the alternative fuels is not quite my area of expertise, but I'll do my best. Can you see where I'm pointing at with this pointer? My colleague is Hyung Rhee, professor, who put this material together. Professor Lim is in the room next to my office, and we came together to talk about alternative fuels for ships. So I will just focus on other alternatives apart from the hydrogen and also nuclear power, since we have a time constraint. And I would like to introduce to you the book written by Professor Hyung Lim. Just briefly, he wrote 4 books. And the latest book he wrote is Understanding of the Eco-Friendly Ships, and the price is 28,000 Korean won. And also I read, and also I also played my role here in overviewing his book. So I would like to also briefly mention this. And this is the first slide and my last slide as well. This is my thought. So whenever you go to the Oscar Academy, the moderator comes in, open the envelope to announce the winner, right? And the winner of the alternative and sustainable and eco-friendly fuel is the one who governs the rules and regulations with the technical background. That's how I think. So at the end of the day, what we do is that we have to understand that we come under so many legal regulations, but there's one condition. We also have to have technical backgrounds. We have to have technical backgrounds along with the legal regulations. And there's a mill and lion, right? Mill and lion is something that I frequently talk about. For example, the mill is like a curb of a different species of horses. And the mill is like the species which has strength and advantage of the 2 different species. The mule is very smart, and according to our fairy tale, mule is not very basic. But then horse is very strong, and the horse is not very good at running long distance for a long time. But this mule is small, but it has very good persistence in traveling a long distance. So mule is used for carrying, for example, cargoes. So shipbuilding industry for the last 50 years, I think they've been like mule for over 50 years, right? We have to think about, we cannot just build something for others. I would like to insist that we need to be like a lion. So when you go to the Premier League to watch the game, lions are the ones who occupy and who rule the arena. And to be lions, we have to govern the rules and regulations. And with technical backgrounds, we have to have solid content inside. Let's be lions. That's all I would like to tell you. And then I would like to share with you this slide that Professor Lim and I put together. So whenever I teach our students, it is very important for me to target the students who are in the middle ground. So please understand if I talk about something that you already know. There's a concept called IMO MARPO, which is at the very center of the rules and regulations. Marine Environment Protection Committee took the lead in IMO MARPO. So it is an international convention, especially to prevent marine pollution. So back in the 1973, MARPOL Convention was established, and also back in the 1978, MARPOL Protocol was established. So combining the two, we have MARPOL, and also there are many annexes which are there to regulate many different harmful substance pollutants. So there are many different annexes. On your left-hand side, there's Annex 6, which is dedicated to air pollutions. And it was implemented from 2015 and 2005. And for the CO2, the regulation, the CO2 started from 2015. So CO2 was added to the Annex 6 as a subject to regulation, and that was a moment where our domestic industries had to really start thinking about how to prepare. And whenever I go, this is one of the graph that I share with the audiences, and there is a GHG strategy, IMO GHG strategy, greenhouse gases, and it was released back in July 2023. And you can see it is outline of ambitions and minimum indicative checkpoints in the revised IMO and GHG strategy. It's all about how we're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So back in the year 2018, this was where we were. And back in 2023, we thought that maybe we have to really achieve net zero GHG emissions. I think some of my slide is not really fitting the frame, but I think this graph well explains about net zero, right? If we just maintain the status quo, then we won't be able to achieve net zero. So we need to make more efforts to achieve net zero GHG emissions. And there are three key elements that I would like to stress today. We have to make decision based on what? Technological, economical impact. The first one is GHG, which is a keyword. And second one is well to wake, tank to wake. So not just the emissions emitted from vessels, but we have to control well to wake. For the middle-sized shipping industry, biofuel is a favored by them. And what guidances are there? These are the things that I would like to tell you. So before 2023, by 2050, we were going to reduce the GHG by 50%, but we changed our plan to achieve net zero by 2050. So whenever we look at the regulation by the IMO, they choose vague and abstract words like around year 2050, right? Around. So net zero, there's a plus and minus element, and we have to make more effort to recognize for reduce greenhouse gases, right? So before, we mainly focused on CO2 emissions, but now we changed our focus on greenhouse gases. And in the past, the target process with TTW, tank to wake, but in the process of using the energy, that was our focus, but now we came to include well to wake from production to the usage. And in the past, biofuel was not something that's out of our sight, but now the regulation for the biofuel is now approved, and it says that biofuels must provide well to wake greenhouse gas emissions reduction of at least 65%, which is a new guidance. So this is a regulation that we have to abide by. So from CO2 to greenhouse gases, we mainly dealt with the CO2 emissions, but from now on, not only CO2 emissions, but also we have to deal with the greenhouse gases and overall, which includes methane and also SOx, N2O, and also CH4. And here, there is one issue. There is a concept called global warming potential, which goes by GWP. So in response to CO2 emissions, how much this CO2 emissions contribute to GWP. And according to the IPCC 6 report, it is up to now, yes, there's no consistency, but CO2 has been a benchmark, and CO2, CH4, and also N2O. So what's worse than CO2 are these things. How we are going to really reduce the greenhouse gases will become bigger areas that we need to focus. And as alternative fuel, we talk about LNG a lot, but we say that the carbon intensity is all different, and what's problematic is methane slip. And on your left-hand side, the 3 bars refers to the coals like fossil fuel and LNG, and also in overall it refers to the greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, LNG is definitely better, right, compared to fossil fuels in producing greenhouse gases. But however, on your right-hand side, the FMS, the FSS, so dependent on how we use LNG, you see the number is going up to like 90. So we have to think about whether LNG is really a good alternative fuel in reducing greenhouse gases. Next. I told you that I'm not going to talk about hydrogen and also nuclear power. Then what's the thing about ammonia engine? So ammonia is not all good, because research reported that NOx and N2O can be generated from the combustion of NH3. And as you saw from this table, the NOx is a bigger contributing factor to greenhouse gases, more than CO2. So in order to reduce the emission of NOx, the book I introduced to you is really a good one. I think it will better help you understand about the mechanism behind it. So in order to prevent the emission of the NOx, more pilot fuel may be required, right? To lower the N2O emissions, more pilot fuel may be required, right? The fuel needs to be combusted well, right? Meaning that we have to put other additional pilot fuel. And some institution mentioned that percentage of pilot fuel would be 10 to 20%, which is higher than LNG engines, right? Then we would just readily use LNG engines, not ammonia, right? And in order to reduce the greenhouse gases from ammonia, additional gas treatment may be also required.
자, 그다음에 이제
So let's move on to the second issue, is to convert from tank to wake, from well to wake. Before 2018, I've measured about NOx and SOx requirements. And since the establishment of SOx and NOx requirements, the indices were introduced as well, EEDI, EEXI, and CII, and they are all about tank to wake. They measure the CO2 emission per transport work. So the mileage is divided, CO2 emission is divided by the transport work. So it is all about fuel efficiency. When it comes to greenhouse gas emission, for that, in order to accurately measure the GHG emission, we need to see the production side of the fuel chain. So tank to wake only saw about the usage, so when the vessel operates. But the suggested concept of well-to-wake is taken into consideration the production of the fuel as well. So if you look at the tank-to-wake part, this is the GHG emission of TTW. So if you compare to fossil fuel, LNG and LPG are better. But we will have to see the final outcome when you consider well-to-wake. For example, hydrogen is 0, considering tank-to-wake. So in short, we need to do transition from material-based classification to process-based classification. Instead of emphasizing what fuel is used, we need to look at how it is made. If you look at tank-to-wake, you can see LNG, LPG, methane, and hydrogen. The result is that if you use hydrogen, you can read 0. But if you look at the well-to-wake GHG emission, LNG is kind of similar, LPG, the bar is higher than the left, and hydrogen. If we produce hydrogen and see the well-to-wake, then the emission is higher than the previous scenario on the left. We say that we can meet the target. So I am sorry to mention this, but whenever I meet with a shipbuilding company and shipping company, they mention that they can meet this environmental requirement that the shipper or shipping companies require, but we need to preemptively adapt to this new criteria while considering well-to-wake. And third topic that I'm going to cover is biofuel. Nowadays, people are greatly interested in biofuel, and biofuel is made from biomass. By definition of the biomass is organic matter that can produce energy. Plants, as you well know, they do photosynthesis and absorb CO2 in the process. And animals, microorganisms eat plants, and that's also biomass. If you look at the different types of biomass, there are wood and others. And we have seaweed, which we have vast in amount. Again, we can use food waste and excretions from animals. So biofuels are all kinds of fuels produced from biomass, for example, biodiesel, bioethanol. But the problem here is that biofuel emits carbon dioxide as well. But we say that biofuel is better because if we think about the entire chain, there's plus and minus, and biofuel is better if we consider all those plus elements and minus elements. As mentioned before, we need to change our mindset from which fuel it is to how they are made. So if we consider how they are made, biofuel is better. By 2050, we need to achieve net zero. So technological pathway is important, but how we are going to be recognized for negative CO2 emission is more important than that. In MEPC 80 published interim guidance, I guess IMO doesn't know this very well, so that's why they attach interim before the guidance part. So it's an interim guidance, and it mentions that well-to-wake GHG intensity reduction should be around 65% compared to fossil fuel. If the country fails to meet that 65% reduction, then the IMO further explains that a conversion factor of equivalent fossil fuel type is assigned. So this means that if the country fails to achieve that goal, then the biofuel does not meet the criteria to be recognized as green. I only have 10 minutes left, so I'll skip this part. Anyway, I'll do my best to cover all these. We have vegetable oils and other sources as feedstock. Again, we have wood, fat, oil, grease, and from this we can make renewable diesel, biodiesel. So for the fuel which have renewables in the term, you need to pay attention to that. To produce biofuel, as you know, there are some controversies because biofuels are made from edible material. To cut CO2, then people ask whether it is okay to use edible material. In 2000, the price of edible biomasses increased significantly. If we introduce wrong biofuel policy, then we may have to invest a lot, yet the biofuel production will end up creating another negative impact. And still, the GHG emission will still be similar or more. And for the poorer country who suffer from famine, then there can be some issues there because of the food security. And another controversy is LUC, land use change. The forests which can absorb CO2 can be suffer deforestation because of the biofuel use. If you look at palm oil, it is coming from oil palm, which is ingredients for raiment and so. They have good volume per unit in production. But if we are to use those oil palm to produce biofuel, then deforestation can be another issue that we need to solve. So another opinion is that to incorporate the GHG generation from LUC within the well-to-wake criteria. On the right-hand side, you can see a table which shows production volume of wheat, corn, and sugarcane. As you can see, a lot of CO2 is produced due to land use change. So from a bigger picture, GHG emission is far higher if there is a land use change. Next, the 65% reduction part required by MEPC 80. For edible biomass or biofuel or oil crop biofuel, these type of sources cannot meet the 65% requirement of MEPC 80. We need to turn our eyes from edible sources of biofuel then to other feedstock, taking into account how they are made. On the right side, you can see a graph picturing well-to-wake GHG emission. Sugar beet, corn, other cereals. So the 65% mark is the red line. The only source that can meet this criteria is wheat straw produce ethanol. And for the biodiesel part, waste cooking oil and animal fats are two feedstocks that can meet that 65% reduction criteria. So without considering the well-to-wake and these type of concerns, it is meaningless. Next is e-fuel. This is another hot topic. E-fuel will have to use renewable carbon sources to produce hydrogen and then produce electricity. So it is all about using feedstock which contain carbon. Just like biofuel, of course, CO2 will be generated in the process, but the carbon source So it is all about how much carbon it can absorb. So it is, if the entire process can be illustrated as alpha minus beta. If the carbon is coming from the fossil fuel, then the problem can get bigger. These are the processes that the e-fuel goes through. If renewable power sources are used, then the outcome can be okay. For example, renewable CO2, direct air capture or DAC, then the net zero can be reached because we absorb CO2 from atmosphere and make the biofuel and make renewable sources of energies, and that's okay. But for feedstock that are non-renewable, and if using non-renewable CO2, for example, steel mill or other thermal power plant, if we make the CO2, use the CO2 of those sources, then the entire well-to-wake does not meet the guideline. Again, case 1, renewable CO2 case is okay, but non-renewable CO2 case is worse. That's why we need to look at renewable sources of CO2. So green hydrogen plus non-renewable source of CO2, then again CO2 will be produced. So green hydrogen plus non-renewable sources is okay for the midway transitional technology, but for the long term it will not be recommendable. The reference that I use is Renewable Energy Directive published by EU. And it requires GHG intensity reduction of well-to-wake to be 70% reduction. So IMO recommended 60%, but EU recommended 70%. So on the right side, you can see the comparison between CO2 from biomass and other fuel sources. Let's jump into conclusion part. Whatever feedstock we use to generate power, there is no single answer that can solve the problem at once. If we choose one thing, other concerns may arise from that. Again, we need to think about other sources of GHG emissions than CO2, and well-to-wake should be considered. And third, if we are to make biofuels and e-fuels, then the sources should be renewable, other than the non-renewable CO2 sources such as steel mill and thermal power plant. So let's go back to this slide again. Rules and regulations are important, so we need to govern the rules and regulations. That's my conclusion. That's it for me. Thank you for listening.